Hello everyone, and welcome to another episode of The True Crime Dish, where I dish about a true crime case while I make myself a dish. It is pretty early on Saturday morning right now, so I'm just gonna make like a breakfast casserole. Super easy. I also just want to preface that I'm not a chef. I just like to cook, so I cannot offer you any kind of cooking advice if that's what you're here for. This is not it for you, okay? But anyways, that's what we're going to be making today while I tell you guys about the incredibly brutal murder of Marilyn Sheppard. Marilyn and her husband were actually high school sweethearts. They had somewhat of an on-again, off-again relationship when they first started dating just because they were so young. But they continued to see each other throughout high school and college, and they ended up doing the long distancing for a little bit. Marilyn was a year older, so she graduated before Sam, and she moved out to New York to go to college and take some classes, and Sam moved to Indiana to take some classes. He was planning on following his father and both of his brothers in osteopathic medicine. After he was done in Indiana, he needed to continue his education, so he moved out to LA. And Marilyn and him continued to do long distance for a little while, but Sam, he was getting tired of it, right? He was ready to take the next step in their relationship. So in September of 1945, he calls Marilyn and he's like, "Hey, I think you should come out to LA. Let's get married." And she was like, "Sounds great." So she went out to LA. They basically eloped. There was no other family or anyone present, but they were super happy. And they ended up staying in the LA area for a couple more years. They got pregnant right away. Unfortunately, that pregnancy did end in a miscarriage, but soon after that they were pregnant again. And then in 1947, they gave birth to their baby boy, Sam Reese Sheppard, but they called him Chip. So that's what we'll refer to him throughout the rest of the story, just so it doesn't get confusing with the two Sams. So they settled in LA. Marilyn found a secretary job, and Sam was still continuing his studies. They were there for a few years, but by 1951, Sam was all done with school, and back in Ohio, where they're both from, Sam's father had a bunch of thriving and growing medical practices, which included a hospital. So he was really eager for Sam to come back and join the family business as the new neurosurgeon. So they packed up, left LA, moved back to Ohio, and Sam started working there as a neurosurgeon. They bought a beautiful home on Lake Erie in a suburb right outside of Cleveland, and things really just seemed to be going well for the family. Sam had started his new job, and Marilyn was keeping herself busy as a homemaker, as a lot of women did back then when their husbands were working. She was an amazing cook. She loved to host people. She loved having her friends and neighbors over. They were very active in their church, and they loved spending time outside. I mean, they lived on a lake, so they loved to golf, and they loved to be out on the lake water skiing. Honestly, this all sounds so cute and wholesome. I wish my family did these things. But we're here, so it's obviously not as wholesome as we may have thought. Sam actually started having an affair with a woman he was working with at the hospital, and it is said that Marilyn knew about this affair and that they were trying to work through it. On July 3rd, the Sheppards had their neighbors over just for, casual dinner, movie night, family night type of thing. Sam ended up falling asleep downstairs on the daybed at some point, and shortly after he fell asleep down there, it's a little before midnight, Marilyn shows the neighbors out. She goes upstairs to put Chip to bed, and she goes to bed herself, leaving Sam asleep downstairs. Sam says that he jolts awake somewhere between 3 and 4 a.m. because he hears Marilyn upstairs screaming for him. So he jumps off the daybed, runs upstairs. He said as soon as he gets upstairs, he walks into their bedroom. He sees some kind of figure wearing a white top hovering over Marilyn, but that was all he saw, because as soon as he walked into the room, he was hit in the back of the head and knocked unconscious. So when Sam comes to, he wakes up to an absolutely horrific scene. He sees his wife lying on her back on her bed, completely bludgeoned. There's blood everywhere. He gets up, he's panicking. He He checks her pulse. At this point, she was already dead. She was 4 months pregnant. Yeah. So they, like I said, had been working on their marriage, and they were allegedly, very excited that Marilyn was going to be having their second baby boy. So that's just so horrible. After he checks her pulse and realizes that she's already dead, he then realizes, where's Chip? So he runs to the very next room over, which is Chip's room, opens the door, and Chip is sound asleep. Hasn't woken up at all. Completely safe. So he's like, okay, Chip is fine. He then hears a noise downstairs, so he runs down the stairs just in time to see this intruder running out the back door towards the Lake Erie shore. Sam runs after this intruder, and a scuffle ensues. He attacks the intruder, and they get into a little scuffle. They're fighting on the beach, and at this point, Sam says that from what he remembers, this man was actually wearing dark clothes, and he had bushy hair. He's a bushy-haired man wearing dark clothes. Again, he said he doesn't remember much because they were fighting for a little bit, and he said he remembers a feeling of like twisting or choking, and then he was knocked unconscious again. When Sam wakes up the second time after being knocked unconscious, he is lying on the beach. He says he's partially submerged in the water. He wakes up and he's kind of hazy, and he notices that his watch is missing as well as his t-shirt. He's pretty disoriented, and he's just like realizing what's happened, and he's hoping that it's just a complete nightmare. Hopefully none of this is true, it's horrific events. And so he walks back up to the house, walks upstairs, and sees Marilyn still bludgeoned lying on their bed, and he knows that the events of the night were unfortunately true. He starts panicking. He calls the first person that he thinks of. Not 911. I know you and I would call 911, but not Sam Sheppard. No. He calls the mayor, who lives right down the street. His good old buddy pal, the mayor. He calls the mayor and he says, "My God, Spence, come quick. I think they've killed Marilyn." Spencer, Hook or Hauk, I'm not really sure how you say their last name, and his wife Esther rush over to the Sheppard's home, and immediately upon, seeing the scene, they're freaking out. They call 911. The mayor himself calls 911. And this is all happening around like 5:40 a.m., okay? So just want to backtrack a little bit. Sam originally says he jolted out of the daybed from downstairs in between 3 and 4 a.m. And then at some point, very, very early in the morning, he wakes up on the beach, goes inside, calls Spencer. They come over, and they say they get there around 5:40 a.m. They call the police. The police are on scene by 6:02 a.m. So pretty fast response time. The cops get there and they immediately start to digest the scene. They go upstairs. They see Marilyn lying on her back. Like I said, she was completely bludgeoned. Later we'll find out that she was bludgeoned 35 times, all in the face. That says a lot to me personally. Not a professional, but that says a lot to me. It was completely unrecognizable. She had her top pulled up over her chest, and then one of her legs was out of her pajama pants, so she was like partially exposed. Immediately they notice that. They start to go through the rest of the house, and they notice that it does look ransacked, like someone had been there looking for something, and there was a trail of blood leading from upstairs down to the back door that they concluded was probably a trail of blood from the murder weapon, which they never found, by the way, or confirmed. There was theories, but they never found it or confirmed it. So they assume that's what that trail of blood is from. They go into Sam's office, and all of his desk drawers are very neatly pulled out. Like, it doesn't look like anything was moved around at all. It looks like literally the desk drawers were just pulled out. And like I said, when Sam woke up on the beach, his watch was missing as well as his t-shirt. Now, I'm not a burglar, but I would think if I was, I wouldn't be like, "Oh, hey man, that's a nice t-shirt. I'm gonna take that too." It just doesn't make any sense. Cops are looking around the house. Just upon, looking at the blood spatter and the stains and Marilyn, they are starting to think that the murder weapon was a surgical tool, which obviously Sam would have access to. He works at a hospital. He's a neurosurgeon. Unfortunately for Sam, they kind of already have their sights set on him. They think that this is a domestic homicide. Sam did sustain some injuries. They get his account of the story and then send him away to the hospital because, like I said, he was injured. But whenever they were listening to his retelling of the story, they just are not thinking this is very probable at all. It just doesn't make any sense to them. Why would this intruder only kill Marilyn? Chip was in the room directly next door. He never woke up. It's also said that the neighbors nor Chip ever heard the family dog barking. You would think, if an intruder's in the house, the dog would probably bark to alert some people. And it just is weird to me that if Marilyn was screaming, Chip didn't wake up. Maybe that's just me, but they were literally in adjacent rooms, so it would be kind of hard not to hear her screams. Officer Drinkin was one of the first officers on the scene, and he is very suspicious of Sam's story. It just doesn't make a lot of sense to him. Although I will say, if we're giving Sam credit, he was knocked unconscious twice, allegedly, so I feel like that would make your memories a little bit fuzzy, but nevertheless, they have tunnel vision. They're starting to believe that Sam did this to his pregnant wife. They sent Sam to the hospital. While he's there, Officer Drinkin starts taking a deeper look at the crime scene. So he's wandering around the house. Like I said, they initially thought, it looked like a robbery. But upon a closer look, Officer Drinkin didn't notice anything really missing, and to him it looked like it was all very staged, especially the way Marilyn was bludgeoned and then displayed. Remember, I told you that she had her top pulled up over her chest and then one of her legs was out from her pajama bottoms, just kind of like exposing her. That usually indicates sexual assault, but to Officer Drinkin, it looked like it was set up to look like a sexual assault as well as a staged robbery. So they really are like tunneling in on Sam already, but it is worth noting that he looked around the house and nothing appeared to be missing. No big valuables were missing. He also went down to the lake shore where Sam claimed that he had that little scuffle with the intruder, and Officer Drinkin said that the shore did not appear to be disturbed as you would expect if there had been a scuffle. Like I said earlier, no one noted the dog barking throughout the night, and more notably, there was no sign of forced entry into the house. And then to top it all off, when the officer was, looking around the house looking for clues of anything, he found a small canvas bag hidden behind some bushes, and whenever he opened it, he saw Sam's watch that he claimed was missing, and weirdly enough, it had blood on it, and then also a keychain of Sam's. To them, that was weird too. If this was a robbery, why was his nice watch in a bag right outside of the house, hidden in some bushes, Sam's t-shirt was never found, which I find kind of odd and unfortunate too. Like, if he did actually do this to his wife, then that t-shirt would be absolutely covered in blood, but they never found it, so we'll never know. Unfortunately for Sam, in light of all this evidence that they were finding throughout the house, they automatically thought, okay, this is a domestic homicide. They weren't treating it like an intruder had come in and killed Marilyn. So they focused very little on actually getting blood evidence and fingerprints, and they didn't have DNA back then. This was 1950s, so they didn't have DNA testing, but collecting blood evidence and fingerprints definitely would have been helpful. They did collect some. I don't think they focused as much on that aspect as they would have if they really believed Sam's story. Back at the hospital, Sam was being interrogated after he was treated for his injuries. They collected his articles of clothing that he did have on at the time. As I've said 100 times, he didn't have his t-shirt. They collected his pants, which did have a spot of blood on them that was on like the knee of the pants, so it looked like Sam had maybe knelt in blood. They collected his shoes, which were waterlogged. They were very wet, so that did seem to make sense with the story that Sam was telling. And he was not budging from this story. This was his account of the night, and he was sticking to it. To him, that was the God's honest truth. As soon as the media got a hold of this case, it was absolutely sensationalized. It is said that at the time, and even today, the case is just as sensationalized as the Lizzie Borden case, which is very interesting to me because I actually had never heard of this case, but at the time it was everywhere. And even today in Ohio, people still talk about this case. The fact that this case was so highly publicized ended up making it very difficult for Sam to get a fair trial, and the press was not shy about their opinion. They had already reached a verdict themselves, the public had, and Sam was guilty. With all the pressure from the public and the press, Coroner Sam Gerber decided to hold a 3-day inquest against Sam Sheppard. So they began that on July 22nd, 1954. Immediately, Gerber was trying to poke holes in Sam Sheppard's story and also play at a possible motive, which was Sam's affair with a woman named Susan Hayes. This allegedly was the affair that supposedly Marilyn knew about. This was a woman that he worked with at the hospital, and they had a pretty hot and heavy affair, if you know what I mean. But of course, Sam denied any involvement with this woman, but Coroner Gerber already had his ducks in a row because he had already made a call to Susan Hayes, and she was going to be there the very next day to testify against Sam. In her testimony, she was fully transparent and said, yes, Sam Sheppard and I did have an intimate relationship. So the fact that Sam lied about it was very sketchy to everyone. Like, if you're lying about this affair, what else have you lied about? This obviously is not a good look for Sam, and the press took off with this story. Some of the newspaper articles that came out around that time were, why isn't Sam Sheppard arrested? And quit stalling, bring him in. So as you can see, the press definitely had an opinion on the matter. Finally, on July 30th, 1954, a little over 3 weeks after the murder, Sam was finally arrested. The following 2 days after he was arrested, he was questioned for a total of 22 hours by 2 different teams, and no one could get any more answers out of him. He was still sticking to that story about the intruder. On August 16th, Sheppard was released from jail on bond. And that same day that he was released, a grand jury convened to talk about all the evidence, and they brought up his affair. They also had a testimony from the mayor, remember him from earlier, who is supposedly Sam Sheppard's friend. He said that he remembers a conversation with Marilyn when Marilyn called her husband a Jekyll and Hyde. They discussed the evidence from the crime scene, Sam's affair, and ultimately came back with a first-degree murder indictment for him. So the very next day after Sam was released on bond, he was arrested again and charged with first-degree murder. October 1954, the trial finally begins. Sam's lawyer had motioned to have the trial moved out of Cleveland because it was so highly publicized in that area, and the judge denied it. They also motioned to have the trial postponed because of all the publicity around the case, and that was also denied. So they're really not off to a good start, and it was said that the judge himself already had a predisposition that Sam was guilty. So whether we think he was guilty or not, he already is not getting a fair trial. On November 3rd, the jury was taken to see the actual crime scene. I've never heard of this happening in another case, but they fully took the entire jury out to the Sheppard's home and had them look around. Following behind the jurors was Sam wearing handcuffs, so he had to walk through the crime scene with them. I don't feel like this is fair at all. I mean, think about what that does in your brain. You're seeing, as a juror, you're seeing this horrific crime scene where someone was brutally murdered, and then you also are seeing a man walking behind you in handcuffs. I feel like subconsciously your brain would just associate those two things. So that just doesn't seem fair to me. But they said, they took a look around the crime scene. They said whenever they got to Chip's room, Sam became highly emotional. It's just really sad. I feel so bad for Chip. Back in the courtroom, the prosecution was focusing heavily on Sam's affair as well as his inconsistencies in his stories, which, like I said, he sustained some injuries, so it's like, of course, he might have some inconsistencies in his stories because he was knocked unconscious twice, according to him. They believe that Sam and Marilyn had been fighting about Sam's infidelities that night of the murder, and Sam just lost it and murdered his wife. They also tried to point out one single fingerprint that they found on the headboard of the bed that looked identical to Sam's. He lives there, so of course there's going to be fingerprints on their headboard. So to me, that shouldn't have even been brought up. And of course, they brought in Susan Hayes, let her tell her story, and they mentioned the fact that Sam had previously denied this relationship, and that just was really suspicious to them. It was also worth noting that during the trial, a lot of the jurors said that they didn't feel like Sam really showed a lot of emotion, like you would be if your wife was so brutally killed. They said that he displayed kind of odd behavior and he was pretty emotionless when everyone was talking about Marilyn. The only time that he really showed any kind of empathy or emotion was when the autopsy slides were being showed during the trial. He asked if he could leave the room, but he was denied that, so instead he just turned around so he didn't have to see it. That was really the only time, aside from being in the house with the jurors, when he got emotional in Chip's room, that was really the only time the jury remembered him becoming emotional at all. The defense, however, was focusing very heavily on Sam's injuries. They were trying to create reasonable doubt for the jurors because the doctor that treated Sam said that these injuries could not have been self-inflicted, and while they definitely could have come from Marilyn fighting back, they were hoping that the severity of his injuries would prove to the jurors that an outside person did this, not Marilyn fighting back, and Sam couldn't have done this to himself. It had to have been a third person. Dr. Stephen Sheppard, who was Sam Sheppard's brother, remember, they're all doctors, he testified and said that whenever he saw Sam the morning after the murder, Sam practically had to be dragged out of the house, like he was blacking in and out still. A nurse that helped care for Sam when he was in the hospital said that whenever he got there, his feet were, you know how like when you sit in water for a long time you get like really pruny? She said that his feet were like that, like super shriveled up and pruny, so to her that indicated that he had been in the water for a really long time. And the radiologist that looked at Sam's imaging said that he had a possible cervical fracture in his neck, and he had obvious swelling at the base of his skull, and he just didn't believe that these injuries could have been caused by Sam himself or even Marilyn. However, the prosecution and the jury were not doubting the realness of his injuries. They fully acknowledged that he was injured, but they proposed a new theory. They proposed that Sam did murder his wife. He runs downstairs, possibly in a panic, runs downstairs out the front door. He's running towards the shore, and he's in such a panic that he trips and falls down the beach steps, knocks himself unconscious, and that's how he gets his injuries. I feel like this is a pretty good theory, honestly. If I was a juror, I would have a hard time disputing that theory, but Sam, of course, denied all of this. On December 17th, the jury went to deliberate. They didn't come back until 4 days later on December 21st, and they found Sam not guilty of first-degree murder, but instead guilty of second-degree murder. Dr. Sheppard was then sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole for 10 years, which maybe it's just me, but I feel like only serving 10 years in prison before you can be paroled is not really fair for murder. It might just be me. Just a sad little tidbit. About a month after Sam was convicted, his mother actually completed suicide, which is so sad. Like, I cannot imagine how the community was treating her. In their eyes, Sam was a murderer, and she was the mother of a murderer. She raised this man. So I can't imagine they were treating her too kind, but it's really sad. She committed suicide. And then about a week after she died, Sam's father actually passed away as well from cancer. So there's just a lot of death surrounding Sam, and it's really unfortunate. So by this point, I'm sure you're thinking, okay, Hannah, Sam has been convicted of second-degree murder. He's in prison. Case closed, right? Wrong. A few months after Sam was convicted, a very well-respected criminologist from California wanted to take a deeper look at the scene. His name was Dr. Kirk. So he flies to Ohio and he takes a better look at the scene, and he concludes a few interesting things. First of all, he says that the murderer was left-handed and Sam was right-handed. So that's interesting. Secondly, based on his findings, he does not believe that the murder weapon was a surgical tool. Instead, he thinks it was a flashlight or something of a similar build. And a few months after this, a dented flashlight was found in Lake Erie. Could it have been the murder weapon? We'll never know. We really won't ever know. They never said. Dr. Kirk also found blood at the crime scene that was not belonging to Sam or Marilyn. So that's very interesting. Now, they didn't have DNA testing back then, so they couldn't like definitively match it to one particular person, but they could tell blood types, and the blood that Dr. Kirk found that didn't belong to Sam or Marilyn was just because it wasn't their type of blood. Also, Dr. Kirk concluded that whoever did this to Marilyn must have really hated the Sheppards. Duh, I could have told you that. But it is weird to me, like, why just kill Marilyn? Supposedly they knocked Sam unconscious twice. Why would you not just get rid of him too? You know what I mean? Now, about 5 years after Sam was convicted, there was a break in the case. A man named Richard Eberling was arrested for larceny. And I know you're thinking, okay, how does this relate to our case? Well, upon searching Mr. Eberling's belongings, they found a ring that belonged to Marilyn Sheppard. Yes, it's crazy, I know. Mr. Eberling was a window washer, and he would wash the Sheppards' windows very often in their home. And the police caught wind of this, and they wanted to play off of the fact that they found that blood in the Sheppards' home that didn't belong to Marilyn or Sam. They were like, this could be our guy. So they decided to play off of that without knowing whether the blood actually belonged to Richard Eberling or not. They started asking him questions, you know, how well did you know the Sheppards? How often were you there? Yada yada. And why was your blood at the crime scene? Richard surprises them a little bit and says, oh, a couple days before the murder, I was actually at the Sheppards' home replacing some storm windows, and I cut myself, and I guess they just never cleaned it up. Really? That may very well be true, but in my head, I'm thinking a family that has window washers probably keeps their house pretty immaculate. I doubt, and they had people over on July 3rd, like I doubt that they would just leave this trail of blood in the house when they were having people over. So that just didn't make a lot of sense to me personally. Another bit of information that Richard offered up was that he knew of a secret entrance into the basement of the Sheppards' home that the cops didn't even know about. So that looks really sketch, right? But the cops decide to give Richard Eberling a polygraph, and he passes. So in their eyes, he was cleared. I know today, in 2022, polygraphs mean absolutely nothing to us, but back then they were actually admissible in court, so they fully believed that he passed this polygraph test. He had nothing to do with it. It's also just worth noting that when Sam saw Richard, he didn't recognize him. You know, like if Sam had been attacked by this man, you would think that he would be like, that's the guy that did it, that's him. But he never formally recognized Richard. In light of all this new information, Sam was actually granted a new trial. And you have to admit, his first trial, everybody was partial. You know, there was no person in that courtroom that was impartial to this case. Everybody had kind of already made up their mind that Sam had done it, and that just wasn't fair. So in July of 1964, a decade after the murder, a judge motioned for Sam to have a new trial. He called the 1954 trial a mockery of justice, and I can't really blame him there. I kind of agree. So upon hearing that from the judge, Sam was released on bond, and pretty much immediately after he was released, he remarried another woman. It's been 10 years at this point. They had been in correspondence with each other while he was in prison. I don't really think that's criminal, but just worth noting. 2 days after Sam was released, the prosecutors decided that they were going to retry Sam for murder. And at this point, they were able to do that because double jeopardy was not law yet. That wouldn't happen until 1969, and they retried Sam in 1964, so they were able to get away with that. So the second trial begins, and the prosecution decided they were going to focus much less on Sam's affair and instead focus on that watch that they found, because they believed that the blood spatter on that watch had to have come from murdering Marilyn. However, the defense argued that that blood likely came from contact with Marilyn when Sam was checking her pulse. They both kind of make sense to me. I feel like that could kind of go either way. The defense also brought up the findings that Dr. Kirk had found in the home, which was the conclusion that the murderer was left-handed. Like I said, Sam was right-handed. And they also brought up the fact that there was blood in the home that didn't belong to Marilyn or Sam. I never saw anywhere in my research whether Richard Eberling was right or left-handed, but I would be very curious to know that. I feel like that would have been very pertinent information, but like I said, they completely cleared him because he passed a polygraph, so I guess they didn't ask any more questions after that. Another theory that was brought forward by the defense was that the mayor and his wife actually murdered Marilyn. They tried to paint the picture that Marilyn and Mayor Spencer Hook had been having an affair. Spencer's wife Esther finds out about the affair and she murders Marilyn. And they tried to say that the bushy-haired man that Sam keeps referencing in all his stories could have been Mayor Spencer Hook. To me, this doesn't really make any sense because they're proposing that Spencer and Marilyn had an affair. Esther finds out, and then Esther and Spencer both decide to go kill Marilyn. Like, if they're claiming that Spencer was that bushy-haired man, then he was obviously at the crime scene. Why would he want to kill Marilyn or participate in a killing of Marilyn if he was having an affair with her? No one ever confirmed that this affair was happening, but there was apparently some indicators that it could have been possible. But that theory just doesn't make much sense to me. I feel like they're just kind of like grasping for straws with that one. After all of the evidence was presented to the jury again, on November 16th, 1966, Sam was found not guilty. Just straight up not guilty. And he was free. But returning to normal life would not prove easy for Sam. He tried to go back to work, working in neurosurgery, but his skills had greatly declined, and actually 2 of his patients passed away while they were under his care. I don't believe that that was like malicious or on purpose. I think he just was so out of practice. I mean, he had been not practicing for about 12 years at this point, so of course his skills had declined a little bit. And he also turned to a life of alcoholism, and with that, his second marriage was abruptly coming to an end. And get this completely shocked me. Sam decided to take up boxing as a hobby in his newly proclaimed life. That's fine. But do you want to know what he called himself? The Killer. That's just not fine, Sam. That's not okay. I would think that if you did not murder your wife, you would not want to be calling yourself a killer. But to me, it's kind of almost like a, fuck you, I got away with it, and now I'm gonna call myself a killer because I got away with this. That's just my opinion. Sam did end up remarrying for a 3rd time, but that marriage didn't last very long because Sam passed away in 1970 at the age of 46. After a very sad life, whether he did this or not, he seemed to have so much going for him. I mean, he was only 30 years old when this happened. I think I forgot to mention that. He was 30 and Marilyn was 31 when she was murdered. They had so much going for them. Their life sounded like it was going to be amazing, and it just took such a sharp turn into hell, honestly. Controversy around the case did not die with Sam, though. In fact, Richard Eberling was later arrested for first-degree murder in connection with an insurance fraud, and while in prison, he supposedly admitted to some people in prison that he knew more about the Sheppard murder than he originally let on when he was questioned the first time. Jailhouse confessions are always super iffy, you know, for numerous reasons. Never fully admitted to anything, even on his deathbed. He never confessed. And neither did Sam. When Sam died, no confession from him either. He stuck to his story until he died. In 1997, Chip tried to sue the county for wrongful imprisonment, but that failed. And then in 2000, they actually had a new trial just to try to put this case to rest because, remember, at this point, it's still unsolved. So in 2000, they held a new trial, presenting all of the evidence again, and they looked at Sam and Richard as suspects. An old neighbor of the Sheppards had come forward and said that he had made Marilyn a table lamp that he knew she kept on her bedside table. And I guess maybe he didn't realize at the time, but upon looking at the crime scene photos, he noticed that that lamp was no longer on her bedside table. And so they brought forward that and thought maybe the lamp could have been the murder weapon. But again, we'll never know. A couple that ended up buying the mayor's house down the street said that they found a pair of fireplace tongs, and that was presented in court to support the theory that Spencer Houck and his wife Esther murdered Marilyn. They said that those fireplace tongs could have been the weapon. And something interesting about that theory as well was whenever that was first presented, the cops were able to prove that Esther had actually started a fire in her fireplace the morning of the murder on July 4th, which was very weird because it was July, so it was hot outside, so why are you starting a fire So they proposed that maybe she was trying to burn evidence, and then they found those tongs way later on, and they thought that that fit their theory really well. And after hearing all the evidence again for a third time, the jury concluded that the 1954 trial actually got it right. They thought Sam was guilty. Unfortunately, we'll never know the full truth about this one. I personally definitely lean more towards Sam did it, but the evidence against Richard really makes me have reasonable doubt towards Sam, so it's a tricky one. Sadly, Chip has really struggled with this his whole life. I cannot imagine the survivor's guilt he had to deal with, being asleep in the room right next door to where your mother and your unborn sibling were so brutalized. Is just unthinkable. I can't imagine it. Rest in peace, Marilyn. Nobody deserves to die like that, especially at 4 months pregnant. I'm sure she was so excited to have their second baby, and her life was cut entirely too short. So yeah, it's unsolved, I guess, technically. I think the consensus is that Sam did it, but I guess since we don't have like foolproof evidence that this is what happened that fateful morning on July 4th, 1954, that it's technically unsolved still. Personally, I think the theory that Sam did it and ran out of his house, ran towards the lake shore, and tripped and fell over the beach steps and hurt himself and knocked himself unconscious, that seems like the most plausible to me, because to me that explains like the lack of forced entry evidence in the house, the dog never barked, the house looking like it had been a staged robbery, and then Marilyn being exposed the way that she was, you know, to the investigators. It just all looked very staged to them, and I feel like this makes the most sense that Sam did it. I feel like he could have even done it while she was asleep, and maybe that's why Chip never woke up or never heard his mother scream, because if Sam attacked her while she was asleep, he could have hit her a couple times and knocked her completely unconscious, and she never would have made a sound. To me, this also explains why Sam called the mayor first and not 911, because that was always very suspicious to me. But think about having the mayor on your side. Like, you know that you're going to be looked at for this crime, but think about having the mayor on your side. That makes a big difference. Even though the mayor did kind of turn on Sam and say that Marilyn did call him a Jekyll and Hyde, I feel like Sam thought, like, oh, I'm going to call the mayor so he can account for how I look, how the crime scene looks, and I'll have him to testify on my behalf. I think the fact that Marilyn was bludgeoned 35 times, all in the head and face, is just complete and utter rage. I don't know why Sam, if he did this, why he would be so angry with her, but I feel like it makes sense that maybe there was more to this affair with Susan Hayes than anyone really let on. So yeah, that's it for this week. Let me know your theories down below, because I'm very curious what everyone else thinks. I'm going to dig into this casserole, and I'll be back next week with another true crime dish. Bye guys.